She just wanted to teach in peace, until a millionaire doctor showed up and changed everything. But what started with a sprained ankle turned into the most unexpected love of her life. Hello, my friends. Before I start this surprising story, leave a comment saying where you're coming from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. The storm that was brewing over New York that Thursday seemed to carry the weight of all the silences Clara Watson had left unspoken throughout the week. The darkening sky, the lightning flashing across the horizon, and the rhythmic sound of water hitting the glass created an almost melancholic soundtrack for the start of her day. From the fogged-up window of the teacher's lounge, she watched the drops run down like disorganized verses of a poem she didn't yet know how to write. The cup of tea, already warm in her hands, brought her discreet comfort. Clara was 28 years old, taught literature at Lincoln High School, and was one of those people who seemed to live more in their thoughts than in the reality around them. Her wool coat was buttoned up to the last button, her brown hair tied in a loose bun, and her eyes were slightly red, as if she had spent the night rereading The People's Rose by Drummond. She muttered to herself as she looked back at the notebooks on the table. "I forgot to check the forecast. Typical of me, always buried in books." Beside her, Debbie, the math teacher, appeared with a steaming mug of coffee in her hand and a warm smile. "It's going to rain cats and dogs today, you know," she joked. Clara let out a soft laugh, looking away. "Good thing my class is about Vinicius today. At least the weather will match the poems." The rain picked up as Clara left school late in the afternoon. The cold air made her cheeks sting, and the sidewalks were already turning into makeshift rivers. She clutched a book to her chest, a poetry anthology given to her by her grandmother, while balancing her bag on her shoulder and trying to open the umbrella that kept crashing. She was a few feet from the bus stop when a speeding car drove straight through a deep puddle, sending a wave of dirty water toward her. The sudden impact threw her off balance, and as she tried to back away, her foot slipped on the smooth sidewalk. There was a loud crack. Clara fell hard, and a muffled cry escaped her lips. Her left ankle throbbed with sharp pain, and she had to hold onto the nearest wall to keep from fainting. Water ran down her clothes, sticking the fabric to her body, and the book fell to the ground, completely soaked. For a moment, she stood there, speechless, as if the world around her had been silenced by shock. "Are you okay, miss?" asked a man in a beret who came running up to her. She tried to answer but could only nod shakily. The man took his cell phone out of his pocket. "I'll call an ambulance. Don't try to get up, please." At New York Presbyterian Medical Center, Clara was greeted with the same functional coldness usually reserved for accident victims on a regular day. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and fatigue, and time seemed to stretch between one stretcher and the next. Once in the triage room, with her ankle wrapped in an ice pack and her clothes replaced by a disposable gown, Clara felt exposed, as if she were emotionally naked. The door opened, and a man in a white coat entered with firm steps. Tall, dark, with austere features and a look that combined clinical analysis with a shadow of boredom. "Miss Watson," he called, looking at the clipboard. She looked up, embarrassed. "Yes." He approached. "Can you walk to the stretcher?" Clara tried, but when she put her foot on the floor, the pain made her retreat with a groan. Andrew Miller grabbed her arm firmly, but not roughly. "Better not to force it," he said in a softer tone than expected. She nodded silently, allowing him to help her. As he settled her in, he noticed her bag lying in the corner of the room, and inside it a book with its pages glued together. "Pizarnik," he murmured, surprised. "A reader of poetry," Clara replied in an almost defensive whisper. "Yes, always." He gave a slight nod, and for the first time his eyes stopped looking indifferent. The examination continued in silence, between clinical touches and contained breaths. Andrew manipulated the ankle with precision, but his mind wandered to the words he imagined written on those damp pages. "It's not common to see someone come here with a book of poems in their bag, especially not from Alejandra. Clara smiled slightly, even though she felt pain. I usually say that books save me from bad days. He didn't answer right away, just held her gaze long enough for Clara to look away, blushing. There was something about her that defied the rigidity of the hospital world, a discreet presence, but one that could not be ignored. You'll need to rest for a few days, he finally said as he wrote something down on the chart. The sprain is moderate, but you'll recover well. Before leaving the room, Andrew hesitated for a brief moment. Take good care of that book. It seems important. Clara blinked slowly, still not understanding what that doctor saw in her that made him speak so kindly. It's one of my favorites, he replied, and only after he left did he realize he was smiling. 3 days later, Clara returned to the hospital for her first follow-up. She was a little more confident, despite the improvised crutch, and the swelling that still persisted in her ankle. She arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time, as she always did with everything in life, and waited in the reception area, slowly reading a poem by Manuel Bandera in a blue-covered book she carried in her bag. The hospital environment, previously oppressive, now seemed to have a different, almost intimate pulse. When Andrew appeared in the hallway, she looked up with an involuntary start. He was wearing the same lab coat, but now, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing part of his forearms and an old watch on his wrist. "Miss Watson?" he called again, but in a more relaxed tone. "If you prefer, you can call me Clara." He nodded with a restrained smile. "Clara, then. Come in." The office was silent, and the natural light that entered through the blinds left golden streaks on the desk. As she settled in, Andrew picked up the clipboard. "How's the pain?" Clara answered truthfully. "Less, but it still hurts to put pressure on it." He moved closer to examine the area, and as he did so, he noticed something new. Above his injured ankle, partially visible beneath the hem of his rolled-up pants, was a small, delicate tattoo, a thin feather drawn with soft, precise strokes, almost like a watercolor sketch. Andrew leaned in a little closer to observe with a discreet gasp. "It doesn't seem to fit your shy personality," he said without irony, just with genuine curiosity. Clara smiled, surprised by the observation. "People are more complex than they seem, Doctor." He looked up, and for a moment they were both silent, caught in that tension that arises when two presences begin to recognize each other beyond formalities. "Andrew. You can call me Andrew." She nodded. "Words are layered too. Like a feather can mean lightness or resistance. It depends on who's looking at it." He resumed his usual posture, but something had already shifted between them. They weren't just a patient and a doctor. It was an exchange. An opening, an unspoken invitation to see the other beyond what the eyes show. In the days that followed, Clara found herself thinking about Andrew more often than she cared to admit. It wasn't an obvious enchantment or an overwhelming passion like the ones described in books. It was a presence that lingered, like a song that plays softly but never leaves your head. She remembered the way he had held her leg firmly and carefully, the way he had studied her book, the pause before he had left the room. At the same time, she knew it was foolish to get her hopes up. Andrew was a doctor, handsome, successful, and she was a public school literature teacher from a simple family in Queens, raised by her grandmother and accustomed to carrying the world in silence. "Don't get carried away, Clara," she told herself one night as she rubbed ointment on her ankle and reread a passage from Pizarnik. That was just politeness, medical kindness, but a part of her heart, stubborn as ever, insisted there was something more, a detail in his eyes, a shared silence, an echo. It was on a sunny Saturday, almost 2 weeks after the appointment, that fate took a new turn. Clara, now without crutches, decided to walk to Central Park to clear her head and write in her notebook. The weather was pleasant and there was live music in the central bandstand. She chose a bench out of the way, near the lake. and took a blue pen and loose sheets of paper out of her bag. She lost herself in her thoughts for an indeterminate amount of time until she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Do you always write outdoors? Or is this a new habit?" It was Andrew, wearing a black t-shirt and dark jeans, holding 2 ice cream cones in paper cups. She blinked in surprise. "I didn't know you frequented parks," he laughed, sitting down next to her. "Let's just say it's a recent habit, maybe influenced by a certain poetry reader." She blushed, but accepted the ice cream he offered. "Vanilla and dulce, de leche. Did I get it right?" Clara smiled. "You nailed it." The late afternoon in the park seemed to conspire in favor of something new. Andrew and Clara remained there for almost an hour, sitting side by side, sharing ice cream and phrases that became more intimate as the sun went down. They talked about a little bit of everything: childhood, fears, dreams that they had set aside. Clara said that she learned to love books thanks to the influence of her grandmother, a seamstress who read poetry in her spare time. Andrew, in turn, confessed that he almost studied photography before medicine, but that family pressure always pushed him towards the more noble path. "My grandmother used to say that poetry saves even when everything around it falls apart," Clara commented, looking at the lake. He smiled at the corner of his mouth. "Mine too. She read Neruda to me when I was little. I think that's why I still get emotional with beautiful words, even after years of being under the knife." There was a pause, the kind that doesn't embarrass, it just deepens. Then he added in a lower voice, "With you, I feel different, lighter." Clara looked away, touched. "I think we all wear armor in the places where we need to look strong." And there, on that bench, 2 different worlds touched for the first time without masks. The following week, Clara received an unexpected message. It was an invitation to see the play Morte e Vida Severina at the Lincoln Center Theater. "It's not and date, it's culture," the message joked, followed by a book emoji. She hesitated, bit her lip, and reread it. After a few minutes, she replied, "Culture accepted, but no pressure." On the night of the performance, Clara wore her best dress, a discreet blue made of lightweight fabric, and tied her hair in a simple bun, leaving 2 strands loose over her face. Andrew was waiting for her at the theater door, impeccable in a dark grey suit, holding 2 tickets. When he saw her, he smiled sincerely. "You look beautiful. I mean, elegant. It suits the play." Clara smiled shyly. "Thank you. You look like you're straight out of a novel, too." The play began, but during the intermissions, the real drama unfolded backstage. In the wine line, Andrew introduced Clara to Karen, an acquaintance of the Upper East Side medical elite. "This is Clara Watson, a literature professor." Karen shook Clara's hand with calculated coolness and a slightly condescending smile. "How lovely. Education really is the basis of everything." Later, while they were having a drink in the theater lounge, another figure approached. Brooke, Andrew's ex-girlfriend, appeared with her naturally sophisticated air and a glass of sparkling wine in her hand. "Andy, what a surprise to see you here, and in such good company." Andrew responded with restrained kindness. "Good evening, Brooke. This is Clara." Brooke looked him up and down and smiled with the corner of her mouth. "How lovely. Andrew, supporting social causes, even in his personal life." Clara pretended not to hear, but inside she felt the impact like a dagger wrapped in expensive perfume. When they left the theater, she remained silent for a few minutes, until Andrew asked if she was okay. "Yes," she replied, but soon after she added, without looking directly at him, "I guess I'm not very good at these places." He stopped, looking at her seriously. "And who said you have to be? I brought you because I enjoy your company, not to fit you into a mold." Clara took a deep breath, feeling the lump in her throat slowly dissolve. "Thank you, really." The evening ended with a late dinner at a small Chelsea cafe, far from the glitter of the elite. Sitting at a corner table, Among shelves of old books and soft instrumental music, Clara and Andrew seemed to finally breathe easy. He ordered a strong coffee and she ordered an herbal tea with lemon. The conversation resumed its natural rhythm, and when Andrew talked about his work at the hospital, he revealed more than he had intended. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had chosen photography. Maybe I would be in some African village, capturing faces and stories, instead of spending my days on a sweltering shift. Clara rested her chin on her hand, curious. "Do you still want to do this?" He hesitated, then answered frankly, "Yes. There's a Doctors Without Borders project in Mozambique. I've thought about signing up, but it always seemed selfish to me." Clara looked at him, gently. "Sometimes following your heart is the exact opposite of that." Andrew was silent for a moment before saying in a low voice, "If I go, I want you to go with me." For a few seconds, Clara couldn't react. The invitation hung in the air like a suspended note, heavy and soft at the same time. She clasped her hands in her lap, feeling the heat of the tea cool without realizing it. Andrew's question hadn't been impulsive. She could feel it in his gaze, in his pent-up breathing, in the way his fingers brushed the side of the cup without realizing it. But for Clara, the idea of leaving everything she knew, her grandmother, her school, her books, her simple routine, seemed too far from reality. "Mozambique," she repeated in a whisper. Andrew nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "Yes. For the first time in my life, I want to decide my path. Not for status, not for obligation. And I want you on that path." She swallowed hard, her heart racing. "Andrew, this is all happening so fast. We've only just begun to know each other." He reached out, covering her hand. "It's true, but you've made me see that I can be more than the exemplary doctor, and I don't want to lose that." Clara lowered her eyes. "What if it's just a fantasy, Andrew? What if you wake up on the other side of the world and realize that I'm just a pretty parenthesis in your life?" He took a while to answer. "Then let it be the most sincere parenthesis I've ever experienced." In the following days, Clara withdrew into herself. She went back to school, resumed her classes, and immersed herself in the texts of Cecilia Meirelles and Fernando Pessoa as if she were searching for answers in the verses. She avoided looking at her cell phone. She ignored Andrew's short messages, which oscillated between "I'm thinking of you" and "I understand your silence." There was a constant anguish in her chest, a fear of risking everything and losing her footing. At night, she would sit next to her grandmother on the porch and listen to her stories, the sound of distant trams mingling with the song of the cicadas. "You've been too quiet, girl," her grandmother once said, without taking her eyes off her knitting. Clara hesitated, then replied, "I met someone who makes me want to step out of line. But stepping out of line, Grandma, scares me." The old woman smiled tenderly. "It really does scare me. But sometimes it's only by stepping out of line that we write a new story." Clara smiled slightly, but inside the conflict was rising like a tide. That same week, news arrived unexpectedly. Andrew's father had suffered a heart attack. Clara found out from a short, cold message sent in the early hours of the morning. "Sorry for disappearing. My father is in the hospital. I can't think about anything else right now." It was as if his world had suddenly collapsed, and with it, everything they had built. She wanted to respond, to offer support, but she didn't know how. She just typed and deleted several times. The following Saturday, she waited for a call, a visit, some gesture. Nothing. Andrew's silence was like a glaring absence. When they finally met again, by chance, in the hospital hallway where Clara had taken an injured student for treatment, he was different. Tired, distant, wrapped in an invisible cloak of responsibilities. "Hi," she said quietly. He stared at her for a second too long. "Clara, this isn't a good time." She nodded. "I understand. I just wanted to know if you're okay." Andrew forced a smile, but his voice was a dull whisper. I'm trying to keep everything together, and in the midst of all this, you've become just one more thing that throws me off balance. Clara felt like a door had closed right there in front of her. The next day, alone in her room, Clara cried for the first time in weeks. It wasn't an overwhelming pain, it was a subtle, constant sadness, like the rain that never stops. It slowly wets until it soaks everything. She wrote compulsively on the loose sheets of paper she kept in the drawer. Not verses, but letters, words she would never send, sentences that only existed because they hurt too much to keep. Maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe you never really included me in this world where you live. Maybe I was just a breath of fresh air amidst the pressure. And yet, even with all that, there was a feeling she couldn't name. Something between longing and hope. At school, Lucy, her younger sister, noticed her dejection. Are you going to let this fairy tale turn into a tragedy just because the prince disappeared from the castle? Clara laughed through her tears. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was just a beautiful chapter that maybe has already ended. But deep down, she knew she hadn't finished the story yet, because every time he looked at Pizarnik's sodden book, he was reminded of how it all began, and how perhaps it could still begin again. The next few months passed like crumpled pages in a book that Clara didn't want to reread. Andrew's absence became routine, a polite silence sustained by spaced messages that never went beyond, "How are you?" or "I hope you're doing well." She responded politely, but with an increasingly sober heart. She focused on her classes, her students, her school projects. She started a book club for teenagers, organized a small used book fair, wrote articles about Latin American literature on independent blogs. And at night, at home, she went back to writing letters that would never be sent, as if each line were a way of purging what was still pulsing under her skin. Andrew, for his part, had fallen back into the hospital routine, caring for his father, dealing with administrative issues, taking on long shifts. And although he kept himself together, there was a void in him that he couldn't fill. "You've gotten good at pushing people away," Brooke said one night when she found him in the cafeteria, "and even worse at admitting that you miss them." Andrew didn't respond, but the phrase stuck in his mind for days. The reunion happened in a completely prosaic way, but with the intensity of a literary twist. Clara had been invited to speak at an educational conference in Seattle, with a panel on the power of literature as an instrument of social transformation. When she arrived at the convention center, adjusting her glasses on her face and nervously checking her papers, she had no idea that Andrew would be there, in one of the parallel rooms representing the hospital at a panel on public health in schools. She caught a glimpse of him first, walking down the hallway with a clipboard in his hands and a concentrated expression. Her heart raced, as if something were pulling her back to a place she thought she had outgrown. She tried to hide, but it was useless. He saw her too, and for a moment they stood there face to face, as if time had returned to the park, the cafeteria, the exam room. "Clara," he said with a shy smile and a new sparkle in his eyes. "I knew you would be here. I called your school. I needed to know where to find you." She clutched the papers tightly. "And now that you've found me, what do you want, Andrew?" The question hung in the air, with a force that disarmed any rehearsed answer. Andrew took a deep breath, took a step forward, and answered sincerely, "I want to build something with you. For real, without promises of distant paradises. Only what we have here, now." Clara looked at him for long seconds, without blinking. He continued, "I spent months trying to understand why I lost you. And I understood that I never gave you space to choose with me. I only offered you an escape. Now, I want a partnership. Real, with your feet on the ground. You taught me that poetry is also structure, is form. So I want to invite you to this, to create something concrete, together." She felt her heart tremble. It still hurt. There were still doubts. But the pain did not prevent her from recognizing. There was truth in his eyes. "And the Mozambique project?" she asked. He smiled. "It's still in my dreams, but today I have another project in mind." A few days later, Andrew approached her with a clear proposal to combine their expertise in an integrated healthcare program for public schools. Something real, tangible, that would unite their worlds in a symbolic and practical way. "I want you to be my partner in this, professionally but also personally, if you still want." Clara listened to everything in silence, processing each word. At the end, she said calmly, "I still want to talk. I still have difficult questions." He laughed, relieved. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, teacher." They arranged to meet for a discreet coffee in the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood to continue the conversation. There were no eternal promises, no crazy plans, just presence, just willingness. That night, Clara returned home with a blank sheet of paper in her hands and the certainty that perhaps it was time to start rewriting her story. The reunion at the conference was just the first step on a path that Clara and Andrew were now treading with much more caution. They didn't start over with declarations or promises, but with comfortable silences and long coffees at corner tables. With each meeting, something was rebuilt. Andrew started picking Clara up in front of the school on Fridays, and together they walked around the neighborhood, talking about the challenges of the week. She talked about the students, the essay, tests, a new shared reading project with single mothers in the community. He talked about pediatric care, the demanding new boss, the emotional burden of dealing with families in crisis. One day, he brought 2 alfajors wrapped in tissue paper. "I remember you said that was your favorite." Clara looked at the sweet in surprise and then back at him. "You listen, even when you seem distracted." Andrew shrugged with a small smile. "It's just that you say things that are worth keeping in mind." These small connections formed something bigger, a stronger bond, less passionate in the effervescent sense, but much deeper. When Clara had an ankle pain crisis due to too much walking on a busy school day, Andrew showed up at her house that same afternoon, unannounced, with a heating pad, an elastic bandage, and chamomile tea with lemon. "You need to stop trying to save the world with only one leg," he said, kneeling in front of her to take care of the swelling. Clara tried to laugh, but she was visibly disconcerted by the gesture. "You didn't have to come." He looked her in the eyes as he wrapped the bandage around her foot. "But I wanted to." The silence between them said more than any sentence. She didn't pull away from his touch. She didn't look away from his gaze. And when he finished taking care of her ankle, he sat next to her on the couch for a few minutes, listening to soft music coming from his grandmother's old record player. One night, while they were eating empanadas, made by Grandma Teresa, Clara's grandmother, in the small backyard lit by lamps hanging from improvised wires, Andrew seemed completely at ease in a world that had previously intimidated him. Grandma Teresa served wine in simple glass glasses and told stories about when she sewed wedding dresses for ladies in the neighborhood. Clara watched the scene with a tight knot in her chest, not of anguish, but of contained emotion. Seeing Andrew there, laughing at Grandma's jokes, complimenting the empanada dough, helping to clear the plates without anyone asking. That was more than just coexistence. It was affection being practiced, not declared. At the end of the night, when Grandma had already gone to bed, Clara and Andrew sat on the doorstep, watching the dark sky. "You know you're different, right?" she said, without looking directly at him. He took a second. "I think I'm becoming who I should have been all along, without the disguises." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "That makes you more dangerous," he chuckled softly. "I promise to use this weapon responsibly." Little by little, Clara also allowed him to see parts of herself that she had never shown to anyone. She showed him her loose notes, the drafts of unfinished stories, the poems she had never dared to publish. Andrew read them attentively, without rushing, and asked questions with genuine interest. "Have you ever thought about turning this into a book?" Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "Do you think anyone would read it?" He nodded firmly. "I would. Because it's honest, because it tells of life as it is, with pain, beauty, and silence. She was silent for a while, looking at the paper in her hands. Then she whispered, "Maybe I really am writing without realizing it." And Andrew added in a low, sure voice, "And maybe that's the truest way to write." The idea for the joint project came about almost organically, one late afternoon when they were both sitting in an empty teacher's lounge after a lecture Clara had given on literature as an emotional refuge in hostile environments. Andrew, with his blazer folded over his arm and his hair slightly disheveled, stared at the whiteboard covered in sentences scribbled by students. "Do you have any idea of the impact you have on people when you speak like that, with so much truth?" he asked, without looking away. Clara smiled humbly. "I think I just give names to pains that many people already feel." He then took out his cell phone and showed a draft of a plan he had been developing for months, medical care integrated with pedagogical and cultural activities in public schools. "I want to build this with you, but not as your idea supporting mine, nor vice versa. I want something hybrid that represents our two worlds, body and word, science and sensitivity." Clara silently read the points he had written and at the end looked up with emotion. "This is more than a project. It's almost a manifesto." Andrew nodded. "And maybe it's our way of giving back to the world what we've learned through pain." In the following weeks, they began to meet not just for coffee and conversations, but for actual meetings. They mapped out schools, collected data on dropout rates, youth depression rates, and lack of basic infrastructure. They talked to principals, social workers, and psychologists. Clara, with her sensitive listening skills, won over the teaching teams. Andrew, with his technical rigor and confident calm, gained the trust of health professionals. One day, after a particularly difficult meeting with an NGO that demanded overly objective metrics, Clara exploded. "They want numbers, but we're trying to talk about people. How can we quantify what happens when a student stops cutting himself because he found meaning in a poem?" Andrew discreetly held her hand under the table. "We'll find a language they understand, but without giving up our own." On the way back, already in the car, he glanced at her sideways and said, "Your anger reminds me of why I fell in love with you." Clara didn't answer right away. She just smiled, gripping the steering wheel more firmly. On one of those nights back, Andrew dropped her off at her door, and before she got out of the car, he did something unexpected. He took a plain, unbleached cardboard box tied with green ribbons from the glove compartment. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "It's not a gift. It's just a memory." Inside the box was a dry, restored copy of the Pizanic book that Clara had lost in the rain weeks ago, the first time they had met. Andrew had had it restored, page by page, until it was almost completely reconstructed. At the end, he had added a new blank page with a handwritten inscription, "To the woman who taught me to listen to what is not said." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. You kept this all this time." He nodded. "I never stopped remembering. I just had to learn to be present again." She held the book close to her chest, as if protecting a piece of her heart. "Thank you. That means more than I can say right now." Andrew kissed her forehead silently, and in that gesture she felt that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to trust again. The next morning, while Clara was organizing the materials for her class on urban chronicles, a student approached her with eyes shining with curiosity. "Teacher, is it true that you're going to work with that handsome doctor who came to the lecture last week?" Clara, surprised, laughed. "Who told you that?" The girl responded enthusiastically. "My father said he heard it on the community radio, that you're going to do a program in schools." Clara arranged the papers, trying to contain the blush on her cheeks. "We're still structuring it, but yes, that's the idea." The student came a little closer and whispered, "I think you two are a good match, like poetry and hugs." Clara smiled, unable to hide her emotion. Later that same day, she sent a message to Andrew. "I still want to be part of this, of the project, of us." The response came quickly. "Then let's really get started, one step at a time." But no turning back. The formalization of the project took place with more emotion than technique. During a presentation to a municipal committee, Andrew stumbled when citing the impact data, and, in the middle of a sentence, he stopped, took a deep breath, and confessed, "Sorry, I'm better with scalpels than with graphs. But I'm here because this woman, Professor Clara Watson, taught me that health is not just the absence of disease. It's also having somewhere to put the pain that no one sees." Clara, sitting next to him, felt a heat rise up through her body. She had never liked the spotlight, but at that moment there was no pride, only gratitude. When the meeting ended, Andrew held her hand and said quietly, "If it works, great. If it doesn't, we'll try again. But it was worth it." She squeezed his hand back. "It will work. Because now we have a worthwhile reason." And that same day, on the bus ride home, Clara felt for the first time that she was no longer a spectator of her own life. He was in the center of it, writing each line with the most sincere ink he knew, his courage. Over time, the project began to take shape. Partner schools were selected, students began receiving preventive medical care, and spaces for listening and artistic expression were implemented in classrooms. Clara taught poetry workshops as an emotional tool, while Andrew coordinated a multidisciplinary care group with psychologists, nurses, and social workers. At the meetings, they exchanged glances that said more than words, and everyone around them could tell there was something different there, something that went beyond the professional. At one of these meetings, Andrew surprised Clara with a discreet gift, a hardcover notebook with pages made of recycled paper and a phrase engraved on the back cover, "Write like someone who heals." Clara opened the notebook, moved, and looked at it fondly. "You know you leave me speechless, right?" Andrew smiled. "I don't want you to be speechless. I want yours to fill this notebook." And she knew, at that moment, that writing was once again, more than ever, a destiny. The evenings were shared again, not with the anxiety of first dates, but with the serenity of true reunions. Andrew was a poor cook, but he made a point of preparing pasta with tomato sauce in glass jars and leaving a note in each one, "To the poet who writes from the heart." Clara laughed to herself as she opened the notes and wrote verses on the lids of the lunchboxes. One night, after a difficult meeting with the city government that almost cut part of the project's budget, Andrew waited for her outside the school in the rain. "You're soaking wet," he exclaimed. "And you're worth every drop," he replied. They walked together to her house, wet and in silence, and when they reached the door, Clara gently pulled him. "Do you want to come in and listen to the first chapter of my book?" He looked at her intensely. "Nothing would make me happier." Inside the room, she nervously opened her notebook and began to read. The story was about a woman who learned to love slowly after years of hiding behind notebooks and silences. Andrew listened to every word without interrupting, and at the end, he remained silent for a few seconds. "You transformed our pain into beauty, Clara. This is real. Literature." She looked at him, her eyes moist. "I only wrote what needed to be said. Maybe what we never managed to say to each other." He approached slowly, held her face carefully, and said in a firm and calm tone, "So let me say it now. I love you. Not because of the idea of who you are, but because you show me every day who I can be by your side." And at that moment, the love between them stopped being an expectation. It became a presence. It became a construction. It became the truth. The months that followed were spent building and discovering. Clara and Andrew learned to exist together in their daily lives, in the mornings with busy schedules, in the nights of exhaustion and silence, in the differences that once seemed like chasms and now became bridges. The project grew steadily. 2 new schools were integrated, and students who had previously barely participated in classes now stood out in poetry and theatre workshops and conversation circles. One of them, Matthew, 12 years old, read a poem about his father's absence and moved the entire team. Clara cried softly as she watched him recite it. "He would never have done it without you," Andrew said, standing next to her. Clara shook her head. "He did it for him. We just lit a candle where it was dark." It was on that day that Andrew, upon seeing her hug the students in the courtyard, thought clearly for the first time. "I want to grow old with her, not on impulse, not because I idealize it, but because..." There in that gesture was everything he had always sought. Clara was also discovering new layers of herself. The workshops she created became texts, then chapters, and with encouragement from Andrew and her grandmother, she finally gathered the courage to submit her manuscript to a small independent publisher. She received the response on a cloudy morning in June while grading proofs on the couch. "We accept your manuscript with great joy. Your writing is needed." She cried out in surprise, covering her mouth with her hands, and ran to the kitchen where Andrew was making coffee. "It's approved," she said, her voice shaking. He dropped the mug in the sink and wrapped her in a tight hug. "Clara, I knew it. I always knew." She laughed through her tears. "It's really going to be my name on the cover, like, for real." He looked at her sweetly. "And it's going to be because you wrote from the heart. And hearts always find readers." The book launch was an intimate, welcoming affair at a simple cultural center in Williamsburg. There were teachers, students, neighbors, hospital colleagues, mothers, school staff, and quietly in the background, Grandma Teresa, her eyes welling up and a proud smile on her face. Clara read from the chapter "First Day of Rain," and when she finished, Andrew was the first to applaud. Beside her, a community radio reporter asked, "Is this male character based on a real person?" Clara smiled slightly. "He's based on a doctor who thought he didn't know how to love, but he learned to listen." After the event, as they collected their books and toasted with grape juice and empanadas, Andrew pulled her aside, near the shelf of old books. "I was wondering, could I write the dedication for our next project together?" She looked at him, amused. "It depends. Will it be a book or a house?" He pulled her close. "With you, it could be both." That same night, Clara wrote the last page of her diary, not the published book, but the old notebook, the one that began with letters that would never be delivered. In it, she wrote, "True love is not made of grand promises. It is made of small gestures, daily choices, and the courage to continue even when you are afraid. With it, I learned that silence can also be caring, that presence can also be a word, and that starting over is a verb that can be conjugated by 2. She closed the notebook carefully, as if ending a cycle. Beside her, Andrew was sleeping soundly, exhausted after the event, with one of the books open on his chest. She approached, slowly took the book and kissed his forehead. "Thank you for staying, for coming back, for staying again." And there, in the complicit silence of that room, she knew that she didn't need perfect endings. She just had to keep choosing and being chosen. The days that followed the book's launch were marked by a calm but meaningful routine. Clara and Andrew began to share not only ideas and responsibilities, but also silences and lazy Sundays. They would wake up early on Saturdays to visit used book fairs and often return home with yellowed copies of forgotten authors, which they would then read together on the couch between sips of tea and old blankets. Andrew, who had previously defined himself only by work, now learned to allow himself to rest, to not fill all his time with goals, to simply be. "Do you know what impresses me the most?" he said one morning as Clara finished correcting essays. "That even in silence, I feel like we're talking." Clara didn't take her eyes off her notebook, but smiled sweetly. "It's because when there's truth, presence speaks louder than words." And that's how the time between them stopped being measured in statements and started being measured in peace. The school project was still going strong. During a visit to a school on the west side, Andrew noticed Clara sitting on the floor with a group of teenage girls, all of them watching her closely as she read a poem about reconstruction. Seeing her there, so immersed in a world he had previously thought was distant, he felt a pang of deep pride. After the activity, as she was putting her materials in her backpack, he approached her and said, "Every time I see you like this, I remember how empty my life was of meaning." Clara tucked her hair behind her ear in surprise. "You've saved lives before, Andrew." He nodded with a half smile. "Yes, but now I know why and for whom." It was the first time she realized that he had stopped wearing his armor. He was there, whole, vulnerable, without needing to protect himself from his feelings. And that was what made her make a silent decision. She would choose him every day for as long as possible. The news that Clara's book would be re-released in an expanded version with texts written by young participants in the project arrived on a rainy morning in November. The publisher had suggested including accounts by the students and joint reflections on the themes addressed in the workshops. Clara accepted immediately, with enthusiasm, and decided that the book would be called Places Where Pain Becomes Words. Andrew was the first to read the new introduction, written with delicate care and emotional firmness. This book is not an answer. It is an invitation to look closely, to hear what is not said, to feel what is hidden between the lines. He closed the manuscript and looked at her tenderly. "You gave yourself to the world, and the world will give you back in the form of transformation." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "I don't want to be great. I just want to be useful." Andrew kissed her hair gently. "You already are. For me, you are where everything began to make sense." On a clear Sunday, sitting under the shade of a tree in the park where they had had their first ice cream together, Clara asked, "Do you still think about Mozambique?" Andrew was silent for a few seconds, looking at the horizon. Then he answered, "I do, but not with the same urgency. Now I understand that making a difference is not about distance, but about depth." Clara nodded, gently touching his hand. "And if you ever want to go, I will consider it." He turned to her with a serene smile. "And if you ever want to launch a book in Portland or do a residency in Austin, I will go with you." She laughed. "Look, we are already making promises." He shook his head. "They are not promises. They are permissions. We are allowing ourselves to dream together. It is different." And there, under that tree, with the sun filtering through the leaves and their hands intertwined, Clara understood that true love does not shout. It remains. It grows. It respects. The final phase of the pilot project was completed with results that exceeded expectations. In just 6 months, school dropout rates had fallen in the participating schools, and more than 200 students had received medical, psychological, or artistic counseling. The impact was visible not only in the statistics, but in the eyes of the teachers, the families who had returned to participate in school life, and especially in the children who had come to see school as a place of refuge and expression. During the official presentation of the results at the Department of Education, Clara was invited to speak. She was wearing a simple white blouse and a blue cotton skirt, as always, without ostentation. But her voice, when she began to speak, carried the strength of someone who had lived every line of that project. Literature is care, medicine is listening, education is a path, and all of this only happens when we allow ourselves to look at others with truth. When she finished, she received a standing ovation. Andrew, from the audience, watched with shining eyes, not out of pride, but out of love. On the way home, still in the car, Clara turned to him and said something she had been keeping in mind for days. "Maybe I resisted so much because I never imagined I could be loved without having to transform myself to fit in." Andrew didn't answer right away. He pulled the car over to the sidewalk, turned off the engine, and looked into her eyes. I didn't know I could be loved either, even on the days when I'm not easy to admire." They stood there in silence, with tears in their eyes, while outside the city continued indifferently. Then he held out his hand and said, "Let's build a house, Clara. Not of bricks, but of choices. A house where we all fit, even on the days when it seems like too much." She held his hand firmly. "Let's go, one room at a time." A few months later, the two were sharing a small apartment in Astoria with makeshift bookshelves, plants hanging from the windows, and a wooden table where Clara would write in the mornings while Andrew made coffee. Grandma Teresa would visit on Sundays, bringing empanadas and blessings, and sometimes after dinner they would take turns reading aloud. Clarice Lispector, Cortázar, Mario Benedetti. It was an unpretentious but deeply developed routine. And when Clara's book was finally re-released, now with stories from the project's young people, she made a point of launching the event at one of the public schools she served. "This book belongs to all of us," she said into the microphone, with Andrew sitting in the front row. At the end of the event, he approached her with an envelope in his hand. "I thought you should see this." It was a letter from the publisher proposing an international publication. "Do you want to take your story abroad?" he asked. Clara read it in silence. Then he replied, "I want to take what we built. If it's with you, yes." On the last page of the new book, Clara decided to include a dedication that hadn't been in the previous version. It was brief, but it carried the weight of everything they had experienced. "To Andrew, who taught me that listening can be more transformative than any scream, and to all who believe that love is, above all, caring." When she showed him the excerpt, Andrew smiled emotionally but said, "You know, I've never been much for words." Clara laughed. "I have words for both of us." He pulled her close, affectionately, and said, "Then promise me one thing, that we'll keep writing this story, even when it seems ordinary." She nodded, resting her face against his chest. "I promise, because it's in the ordinary that truth lives." And that night, sitting together on the porch with a blanket over their legs and the silence shared between them, Clara knew there were no more beginnings or endings, just a chosen path day after day. Early the following spring, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news came as a soft whisper between two classes and an unexpected bout of nausea. She felt the world spin for a few moments, not with fear, but with awe. She ran her hand over her still flat belly, closed her eyes, and smiled to herself. That night, she prepared a simple dinner, lit candles, placed a poem by Vinicius on the table, and waited for Andrew to arrive. When he came in, tired from his shift, she hugged him tightly and whispered in his ear, "There's a new heart beating inside here." He stood still for a second, his gaze lost in hers. Then he smiled, his eyes brimming with tears. "We're going to have a child." Clara nodded. "A son, or a daughter, or poetry in the form of a person." Andrew knelt before her and rested his forehead on her belly. "Then let's write the most beautiful story of all." The months of pregnancy were lived with sweetness and simplicity. Clara continued teaching as long as her body allowed, and Andrew adapted his schedule to be more present. They painted the baby's room together, chose children's books, and created a playlist with songs that would accompany their journey. The nights became slower, the conversations softer, and the love, which was already deep, gained layers of delicacy. One day, when she felt the first kick, Clara took Andrew's hand to her belly. "He's saying hi to Daddy." He smiled, his eyes full of light. "Do you already like Neruda?" She laughed. "You'll learn to like him, or to write your own verses." And in that moment, between slow breaths and intertwined hands, they knew. They were ready for the next chapter. The birth took place on a cold morning, but Clara felt enveloped by an inexplicable warmth. Andrew held her hand throughout the process, repeating softly, "You are the strongest woman I have ever known." When the baby's cry echoed through the room, The two looked at each other as if time had stopped. It was a girl. Clara took her in her arms with tears streaming down her face and whispered, "Welcome, Lucy." Andrew, upon seeing them together, lost his speech. He simply hugged them as if protecting an entire universe. When leaving the hospital, already at home, Clara sat in the armchair on the porch with the baby in her arms, Andrew by her side, and said, "I thought love was something distant, but today I know it. Live's here." He leaned over, pressed his lips to hers, and the kiss they shared was more than passion. It was a promise. It was presence. It was the future. On the last page of Clara's new diary, where she no longer wrote letters to the past, but chronicles for the future, she wrote, "It took me a while to understand, but true love is not made of urgencies. It is built on days when no one sees it, in the simplest gestures, in the most silent choices, and when it blossoms, it doesn't need applause, only care." Beside her, Andrew slept with Lucy on his chest, both breathing in the same rhythm. Clara watched that scene as if reading the final sentence of a life-changing book. Then she smiled, approached slowly, and before joining them on the couch, whispered to herself, "And that's how I found my happy ending, within a new beginning." If you like this story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. Hasta luego.